Greetings and welcome back to Haynes and Boone's Media Minute podcast, which is focused on legal developments and trends impacting the media and entertainment industry, intellectual property, open government, and First Amendment law. I'm Nathan Koppel, Haynes and Boone's Director of Media Relations, and I'm joined today by Haynes and Boone partner Laura Prather, who is head of the firm's Media Law Practice Group. Laura has long been heavily involved in the legislative process in Texas, advocating for many landmark laws that have strengthened First Amendment rights in the state, including the Texas Citizens Participation Act, the state's anti-SLAPP law. She spent a lot of time this year at the Texas Capitol and will talk to us about some of the laws passed this year that impact First Amendment rights and governmental transparency. Before we get started, our standard disclaimer. This podcast is for informational purposes only, is not intended to be legal advice, and does not establish an attorney-client relationship. The topics we discuss are subject to change. Legal advice of any nature should be sought from your legal counsel. And with that aside, Laura, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Nathan. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, as most listeners know, the Texas legislature meets every other year, typically for about 5 months. They convened in January of this year and are still at work in a special session. So I'm curious, Laura, what does a typical session look like for you? What's the range of legislation that you cover, and how do you go about advocating for and against bills?
Well, the Texas legislature is a bit of an anomaly when it comes to state houses. The legislature, like you mentioned, only meets every other year for 140 days. And just to give the listeners an idea of kind of how stacked against the passage of bills the legislature is, it meets for 140 days, and the first 60 days of it, the lawmakers can only vote on the governor's emergency items. And so really you're talking about maybe 2.5 months to get everything done. And it is, a multi-step process with the committee hearings and the floor votes in both of the chambers, sometimes conference committees, et cetera. So given how condensed the legislative session is in Texas, so much of the work has to be done during the interim. It has to be done in the process leading up to session so that you can get coalitions built, so that you can draft legislation, so that you can seek out sponsors, educate the public, and get people engaged in the process. I can go into that in a little more detail, but really, if you're trying to get something passed, you've got to do your work outside of the session and be prepared when session starts, hopefully with agreed upon measures that can advance through the process quickly.
Yeah, I'd be curious if you could add a little detail. What sorts of work then leads up to it? I don't know if there's any coalitions that you're involved in, Laura, or just any more details you'd care to provide about that process would be interesting.
Yeah, so what we do, and this is a process that has really worked for us. I'm sure all advocates have different approaches, but the work that we do is primarily on First Amendment issues and government transparency issues. And those issues they're not right side of the aisle issues or left side of the aisle issues. They're just good governance issues. They're issues that are good for the citizens of Texas. And so what we do is we seek out other groups that have a shared interest in whatever it is that we are advocating for. And we build broad-based coalitions of groups on the left and on the right that have this shared interest. And then we develop a platform. So this last session, for instance, we were really trying to improve government transparency and help people regain trust in their government. We've seen that trust in government is at an all-time low, and especially with some of the closing off of access to information during the pandemic, naturally people want to know what's going on with their government and how their money is being spent and how the time that government officials are spending, how that's being spent as well. So we built a coalition. This one was called the Transparent and Accountable Government Coalition. And it had groups from, again, both sides of the aisle, everyone from the left, ACLU or Public Citizen, to more right leaning organizations like Texas Public Policy Foundation or Institute for Justice. And these various groups, we had more than a dozen, came together and agreed upon a platform of bills that would increase transparency during times of emergency. It would increase accountability in government record responses, and it would update the Texas Public Information Act to modern times so that it could work better in this digital medium that we are all working in right now.
Wow, yeah, it really underscores the amount of preparation that goes into any session. So with that, I'd like to turn to the current session.
Let me add one thing to that, though,
Sure,
Nathan.
yeah.
So the building of the coalition, honestly, is like that's step one, and then step two is educating the public. And so what we also do is we partner with these coalition members and we put on seminars to let the public know about issues of concern and to get them engaged in the process. Because after all, you want the public to reach out to their lawmakers when they have concerns. And so we did 4 different seminars leading into the session on all of these various pillars that we had that we were trying to get past. And so part of the process is assembling the coalition. Another part of the process is educating the public. And then the third part of the process is the nuts and bolts drafting and getting sponsors at the actual legislature.
And I'm just curious, does that education process do you have to start it anew every 2 years, or have you built enough of a foundation over time that that most legislators sort of understand the importance of governmental transparency and some of the free speech rights that you would advocate for?
I think we have a really strong base of supporters who understand it, but because there's so much turnover, there is always a re-education process, both at the Capitol and with the general public. So, people want to be and need to be engaged in the process, and in order to get them engaged in the process, you have to motivate them. And the way you motivate them is to help them understand the initiatives at hand.
It makes sense. Well, I'm gonna turn to the current session. Let's start by discussing House Bill 54, which was signed into law in May and prohibits reality TV programs from filming law enforcement activities. It's a fascinating law given the popularity of reality cop shows, and I'm just curious, what was the impetus for the law, and what are your thoughts about it?
Sure. This law, the impetus was just a tragic circumstance of events. A gentleman by the name of Javier Ambler um, was essentially tased to death by law enforcement. He had a cardiac problem, and he was pulled over for failure to dim his lights. But the encounter became very rough, and I think he tried to flee. And in that process, this tasing occurred. Both the Travis County and the Williamson County law enforcement officials ended up at the scene. I think he started in Williamson County and then drove into Travis County. And in the process, some of the after he passed away, some of the body camera footage became available through Travis County, not through Williamson County, but it became apparent that in fact there was a reality television crew actually in the back of the Williamson County Sheriff's Department car from the television show Live PD. Now, Live PD never aired this program and I believe has a policy that they won't air any fatalities. But there was a huge outcry about the fact that there was a television crew on the scene at the time of this gentleman's death. Because of that, HB 54 was introduced into the session, and it honestly sailed through. There was one amendment that was made to it to try to clarify that a reality television program does not include reporting on matters of public concern by a journalist. So trying to essentially carve out those regular, news ride-along type events that happen. But it sailed through both chambers. I think that it got to the governor's desk well before the end of session and was passed into law before the session even ended. So it is supposed to be directed towards the live PD scenario, but I can tell you, Nathan, it's already had repercussions outside of that. We've already had newsrooms that have been told they can't come on ride-alongs. There's already been issues concerning other shows that are now very concerned about filming in Texas that are not, typical ride-along shows like Live PD was, but that would arguably fall within this definition. And I think that we're going to start seeing less and less filming and accountability of law enforcement in the state of Texas as a result of this.
And again, the law, at least ostensibly, would exclude news gathering or the filming from by news organizations. But the point you've made, Laura, is it's perhaps hard to. Sometimes that distinction is lost in real life.
I think that's true, and I do think that this will be the subject of a constitutional challenge. I think that at some point in time there'll be a constitutional challenge to this law, both for vagueness and for the disparate impact on different content. Under the Constitution, you're not supposed to have content-based regulations like this, and this is very clearly imposing restrictions based on content in the law. And so I do think at some point in time there will be somebody who will make a constitutional challenge to this particular law.
Okay, I'm going to ask you then about Senate Bill 930, which I understand has its roots in the pandemic and imposes requirements on nursing homes and long-term care facilities to report information about communicable diseases. Is this a win for freedom of information advocates?
It definitely is, and it was one of the Transparent and Accountable Government Coalition initiatives. One of the things that happened during the pandemic was there were significant outbreak at nursing homes of COVID, and you had family members who were not able to be informed about whether or not their loved one was in a nursing home hotspot. They were not able to properly evaluate if they wanted to try to move their family member to another nursing home, whether or not they were a hotspot. And the Health and Human Services Commission was not giving out the information. This ultimately became a subject before the Attorney General's office, where there was a challenge to the fact that HHS was not giving this information out. And the AG said, no, look, this is not protected health information. We're talking about statistical numbers, not personally identifiable health information. And this information should be disseminated to the public. They should know where the COVID hotspots are. And so that piece of it got fixed through the AG process. But as you likely know, AG decisions are only good while you've got that AG and until somebody changes those decisions. And so I think that the AG's office, as well as the folks in the TAG Coalition and several lawmakers, thought this needed to be codified, and not only codified as to the Health and Human Services, but also local health authorities, to give local health authorities and the statewide health authorities essentially the requirement to release information about infectious disease outbreaks in those nursing homes and in assisted living centers so that people will know if there's a problem.
And it just seems like such a vital measure now that everyone understands the dangers of transmissible viruses. Does it, apply just to those settings, nursing homes and long-term care facilities, or is this a template for similar duties in other settings?
Those settings were excluded under the law, so it fixes the fact that they had been excluded under the law, and it's
I see.
directed specifically toward them.
Well, let's turn to another important transparency measure, House Bill 929, which was called Bo's Law. Can you tell us about this one?
So this, I would say, was really the shining and sole example of law enforcement reform that came out of the session. Going into the session, we had so many issues concerning law enforcement transparency. The Javier Ambler incident that we mentioned above, and the inability to obtain body camera footage from that. There are issues that concern the lack of access to use of force documents held by law enforcement. There is a loophole in our Public Information Act that if a suspect dies in custody, then law enforcement gets to decide whether or not the information is disclosed to the public because the person was not convicted and the arrest did not result in deferred adjudication. So there's all these loopholes in our law that foreclose transparency and accountability with law enforcement. There were a number of bills this session trying to rectify some of those problems, and the sole one that got through was HB 929, Bo's Law, and it is the impetus for it was the death of a 26-year-old Price Waterhouse Cooper, a young black man who was killed by a Dallas police officer who was off duty. She killed him in his apartment mistakenly. She says thought he was an intruder in her apartment. She actually went into his apartment. Instead, they lived one floor apart and killed him.
Very high-profile murder.
High-profile murder. She's been convicted of murder. She is serving a 10-year sentence right now. And what the law says is it requires law enforcement to keep their body activated cameras on for the entirety of an officer's active participation in an investigation. So you can imagine if things go south, a law enforcement officer might be tempted to turn off that body camera. This requires them to keep that body camera on so that there can be a start to finish bird's eye view of what happened.
And if they violate that, Laura, what are the repercussions?
There's a criminal penalty for violation of that.
Well, it seems like such an important measure. It seems like there's heightened, I would say, public awareness about policing, and it's that sort of footage is really the primary source material for the public to know, when instances do go wrong, what happened.
Absolutely, and there's been studies that have been done that actually say that with the impetus of body camera footage, there's actually been more police accountability, and because and less use of force, because people know they are on camera all the time. So that's something that has been used to help fund more body cameras for law enforcement, and hopefully, will continue as the public to be able to have access to that information.
That's excellent. I'm going to ask you now about Senate Bill 149. This applies to drones. It seems like hardly a week goes by that I don't see drone activity. This law, which was signed into law in June, criminalizes operating a drone over airports and military institutions. Curious to hear your impressions about this one.
This has been something where more and more items get added to this list. It seems like every session. I mean, there's an entire regulatory framework for drones where you have to get them approved, and through the FAA, you've got all these different state laws that prohibit where they can and cannot go. And every session, it seems like we add more areas where they cannot go. This one adds military installations owned or operated by the federal or state government. It's added on to a long laundry list. And I think what we're dealing with here is really trying to balance out some competing interests where you don't want to have, essentially the bad guys have access to information about your critical infrastructure. I think one of the problems with our drone law in Texas is we don't have a news carve out. And because we don't have that news carve out, there is less accountability that takes place, that could be taking place if there were a news carve out, to be able to see if there's something untoward going on in these various places.
Do you know if news organizations are active users of drones, or is whether they are or not? I'm sure there's a concern that they might be at some point.
They are active users of drones, and more so as newsroom staff gets cut. Drones end up being able to provide a tremendous service. During Hurricane Harvey, the drones were the ones that were able to help facilitate rescues and help show viewers where not to go. So they serve a tremendous public service. But there was concern if these drones were going to accidentally go over one of these critical infrastructure facilities during the process of trying to serve the public and get needed information out to Hurricane Harvey victims. So you can see the conundrum.
And it sounds again like you're worried that there's a real slippery slope going on in Texas where we continue to make certain things off limits to drones.
I think so. I just think that both sides need to consider the competing interests so that the public doesn't get lost in the shuffle. The needs of the public need to also be considered in this process, and their ability to get information, especially during times of emergency like a hurricane or other times when drones can get to places where human beings can't.
Yeah. So I assume in any session, many important bills never cross the finish line. I'm curious to hear about some of the notable bills this session that never made it to the governor's desk.
So there were a number of TAG coalition bills that didn't make it to the governor's desk. But like I said at the beginning, it's the whole framework is set up that way. There were over 7,000 bills filed this session, and only 1,073 got to the governor's desk, and 80 were vetoed. And so you're looking at about a 14% chance at passage. Two of the TAG coalition bills got through, 2 out of 8. So we had a 25% record, which is really good. But some of the ones that were left on the cutting room floor were one that we had specifically written to address some abuses during the pandemic by government agencies of failing to respond to Public Information Act requests while they were operating under a skeleton crew. And skeleton crew is in quotes. You can't see me quoting it, but I am. And the reason I'm doing that is because that is from an attorney general guideline that said from a long time ago, if a governmental entity is operating on a skeleton crew, it doesn't count as a day towards responding to a Texas Public Information Act request. That was meant for the odd snow day here or there, not for a pandemic that has now lasted 18 months. And certainly not for a situation where employees are collecting a paycheck working from home with full access to their computers. But unfortunately, we saw during the pandemic a number of agencies that used this skeleton crew guidance from the Attorney General's office to ignore completely Texas Public Information Act requests. So we had a bill that actually was passed out of the House with applause, lawmakers applauding it as it passed out of the House, that would have rectified this problem. And it like a number of our bills, died in the Senate. A number of really good transparency measures died in the Senate this year.
And I just add, Tom Williams has been on the podcast, I think once or twice, talking about the skeleton crew
Yep.
provision and some of the possible abuses that spring from it. So that's a shame.
Yeah. So that was one of our that was one of the ones that was a shame. There were some others that dealt with being able to access information in a searchable, sortable format. Sometimes you'll have government officials produce to you an Excel spreadsheet in a PDF form, so you can't search or sort it. And this became an issue when we were trying to figure out which places were shut off as a result of the ERCOT power breakdown during Winter Storm Uri. And news outlets would just get a PDF instead of a searchable, sortable format of the spreadsheet in which it was kept. So you could see what had been taken down and what hadn't been taken down during that winter storm. That was also left on the cutting room floor. Some other provisions to update the TPIA and have government contracts online so that people can know how their money's being spent easier was left on the cutting room floor, and others.
And I'm sure, Laura, just as a backdrop, are you constantly in communication with news organizations where they're saying this is really what's giving us problems? We're getting these huge production of documents where it's impossible to search and sort it, and it's almost useless to us. And does that sort of govern the items that you and the coalition focus on? And
It is. I serve on the board of an organization called the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas, which acts as really a statewide central repository for information and education to the general public about our Public Information Act. And so citizens will call and seek out guidance from the organization, from the attorneys that serve the hotline and others, and they'll say, look, this is the problem that we're running up against. How do we fix it? And a number of the laws that we've been able to get passed over the last decade have arisen from very concrete examples from constituents here in Texas, that we've then taken to lawmakers, and they've solved the problem through the legislative process.
any other near misses from the last session that you'd highlight?
I think the thing that people should understand is we always go into these sessions with lofty goals of what to pass. What we don't know is what we're going to be defending against. And sometimes the best sessions are those in which you've had a successful defense, even if your offense hasn't succeeded as much as you'd like.
Mm-hmm.
And this session, I would characterize that way. I would say that we really prevailed on defense because there were a number of bills that would have really harmed government transparency. There was one bill in particular that would have flipped the TPIA on its head and put the burden on the requester to have to appeal redactions from the government. It would have empowered governmental bodies to redact their documents and just give them to requesters as they saw fit, instead of going through our current process where it's the governmental body who has the burden to appeal, not the requester. That was a big bill to defend against, and it would have been a sea change in our law. And so the fact that we were able to defend against that bill being passed was a huge victory. It's not one that you hear about because
Sure.
the bill died, but that was a big victory. And we had similar potential encroachments on First Amendment rights that we were able to also stall in the legislative process. So I do feel like it was a good session, and that a lot was accomplished, even if you can't see it on the books as far as laws that passed.
Yeah, defense never gets the attention that offense does. So overall, would you rate it a successful session?
I would. I do think we made some inroads on increasing government transparency. We also help to educate and inform and lay a foundation for next session about some much needed change. And I think we had very successful defense.
And before I let you go, I just want to clarify. So the legislature is still considering different measures, but in terms of transparency legislation and free speech legislation, they're done until the next session. Is that right?
It all depends on what the governor would like. Right now, we're in our second special session. The governor, gets to decide what items are considered during special sessions, which can last no more than 30 days. One of the items on the call for this special session deals with social media speech regulation. That is the only thing that sort of touches on these aspects, and it's about whether or not one can be censored on social media. But other than that, the governor has not added to the call any transparency measures or any First Amendment issues that would fall within our normal purview.
Well, Laura, thank you so much. Very, very helpful survey of what's gone on at the legislature over these many months. Before we sign off, I'd just like to invite listeners to visit the firm's revamped website at haynesboone.com, where you'll find the firm's media and entertainment litigation practice page, which contains links to our media, entertainment, and First Amendment newsletter that covers many topics that I think will be of interest to listeners, and also features all of our HB Media Minute podcast, among other information. Thanks for listening, and take care until the next HB Media Minute.